So without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor and quickly introduce our speaker tonight. So we are very privileged, happy and honored to have with us tonight Dr. Salvador Macip. He's a doctor, a researcher, and a writer. One of his books is currently being re-edited on Modern Epidemics, from the Spanish flu to COVID-19, which is available for pre-orders if you're interested. He's currently an associate professor at the University of Leicester, but also works at the Open University of Catalonia in the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology, investigating mechanisms involved in cancer and aging. You might think not directly related to epidemics, but he has wider interests as well, and has actually been the face of science, especially on Spanish TV outlets. And he will be a familiar face if you're from Spain, probably. If not, you might not know, but he will be the perfect person tonight for to answer any questions we might have on COVID. So without further ado, I will make you host and we can listen to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Elena, and thank you for everybody for coming to this talk, and thank you for inviting me to inaugurate this session of talks. And I hope we can have a nice discussion on this topic of COVID and the vaccines in general. And I think this initial poll was quite interesting already to get started by and see what your answers were. Just to give you a spoiler, I would have said probably the same thing that most of you said, that yes, I would take the vaccine right away, and no, I don't think this should be compulsory. And we can discuss this why over the course of the evening. And I hope after my talk, maybe I can turn some of these no's into yeses and get some more appreciation for this vaccine. So I thought, well, as Elena was saying, I'm not a microbiologist at all. I'm a medic, as you all are going to be, and my interest lies in the basic mechanisms of cancer and aging, because they're quite related. But I got thrown into this sort of the COVID arena in the media in Spain because of this book I published 10 years ago, in which in the last chapter I was predicting in a way that there was going to be a pandemic sometime in the future, and that we should prepare for it. So it turns out that I was right. I wish I hadn't been. And here we are in the middle of a pandemic and very poorly prepared. And for this reason, I kind of have been talking about and writing a lot about this lately, so I'm a bit up to date. So that's, I guess, why you have asked me here today to talk about this topic. So I'm going to do a presentation, and then we can have a questions or discussion on all these topics. So let me see if I can share the screen. So what I thought I would do is not only talk on the COVID vaccines, but give you also a bit of a perspective of microbiology, which I think it's something that sometimes perhaps we're not aware of the implications of sharing the planet with a lot of microorganisms. Right. So as Elena was saying, I'm a lecturer here, an associate professor at the University of Leicester, and I teach mostly in the biomedical students, although I've done some teaching as well in the medical school. And you guys see the presentation, right? So I'm going to start then by giving you a bit of a perspective, as I was saying, on our relationship with microorganisms. Actually, microbes are much older than us. So life in this planet started with microorganisms. So we already had microorganisms 3,000 million years ago. So we are actually descendants, we could say, of these microorganisms. And even now, we know that there's more than 1 million different kinds, and we probably haven't even scratched the surface of all the different microorganisms that exist in this planet. It has been calculated that if we put together all the microbes on Earth, they would weigh 25 times the weight of all the animals of the planet. So they really are overwhelmingly bigger numbers of microorganisms compared to the animals. And you could say actually that this is their planet. They've been here before us. They're more than us, And they're probably going to be here even if humanity disappears. Microorganisms will still be able to survive in this planet. And obviously, microorganisms are essential for life. So there's something that that we need to learn, that microbes, we cannot get rid of them, and we actually live in peace with them, and we have been living in peace with them for a long time, for most of the times. Actually, we are a combination of human cells and microbes. The body is made of around 30 trillion cells, but on top of that, we have at least 30 trillion microbes also on top of us, inside of us. If you put together all this, what we call this microbiome or microbiota, that is all the microorganisms that live with us in our body, that would weigh around 2 kilograms for an average 70-kilogram person. So we are then colonized by at least 400 different types of bacteria, mostly. There's some viruses as well, but mostly we are traveling with a lot of bacteria on top of us and inside of us. And the important thing is that all these microorganisms that we discussed, most of them are not bad. So we only know around 1,500 microorganisms that are actually pathogens, that are actually cause disease. The rest of millions of microorganisms that we know, they're just basically not harmful to us. There's an important thing to be aware of. I mean, the average human lifespan has always been short. I mean, humans have evolved to live around 30, 40 years as average, because there was a lot of mortality in infants over history, and we are not, our bodies are not ready in theory to live until the old age. But we learned over time, and that's where medicine comes in, to get rid of diseases, mostly infectious diseases. And this is how, from at the start of the 20th century, we turn around this sort of average lifespan that human had into something like much more different. So 45 years at the beginning of the 20th century to around 80 years average that we have nowadays. So we more than doubled our lifespan. And a part of this, or a big part of this, is because we managed to find a way to survive the infectious diseases, that survive these pathogens that share the planet with us. But there's an important issue also that to remember, that this is not homogeneous. So there are parts on this planet where the average lifespan is still very low, still around 50 years. For instance, the Central African Republic is the country with the lowest average lifespan, while the highest is in Japan, and it's around 85 years old. So there's a huge gap between these two countries. And an important part of this gap with survival is, again, because of infectious diseases that have not yet been controlled in these countries, which the lowest average lifespan. If you look at this, at the causes of death in the last century, I think they are quite revealing. So this is a table with the causes of death in males and females in 1915 compared to 2015, so in the last century. Sorry. So if you look at 1915, the main cause of death is infections in all age brackets, from infants to 70, 74-year-olds. All people would be dying mostly of infections. There's a bit of senile decay in those few that manage to live until all the ages. We see this in men and women, and we see in women some heart problems, which we know that are more prevalent in females. But as you can see, the main cause of disease at the beginning of the 20th century was infections. Now see how this has changed only 100 years after. Infections are not our main problem anymore, and we now can die of diseases of old age, like cancer, heart conditions, and dementia. And always there's in young men, mostly the principal cause of death is usually external, like accidents and violence. But apart from that, most of us now get to the older ages, and most of us are going to be dying of old age diseases, not of infections. So this is a huge change in only 100 years. So we've been fighting this never-ending war with microbes for all our history, and we are finally, in the last 100 years, managed to be on the winning end of this. But over our history, we experienced a lot of pandemics. So what the situation we're seeing now is nothing compared to what we've seen over the last centuries or millennia in the human history. So some famous ones, for instance, the Black Death killed 25 million people in the Middle Ages. So it was a good chunk of the European population died because of a single disease. The famous, and this is closer to us, in only 1 century ago, what was called the Spanish flu. It was just a flu, a pandemic flu that killed between 20 and 100 million people. That's a huge number. Until the mid-20th century, even in wars, you could see more people dying of infectious diseases than actually by weapons. So people would actually die, soldiers would actually die of infectious diseases more than by weapon wounds. So the amount of death caused by pandemics and epidemics was huge until very, very recently. And probably the most famous case would be how Europeans basically conquered the Americas, thanks to the fact that 90% of the Native Americans died in less than 100 years due to infections that were brought from Europe. So the Europeans had this ally in these wars in America that were all these diseases, or these infectious diseases that they brought with them. Even deep in the 20th century, we still had diseases, terrible diseases like smallpox. You can see here a picture of a boy with smallpox that killed around 500 million people in the last 100 years of existence of this disease. It was eliminated in 79. Actually, it's the first infectious disease ever that we can call eliminated from Earth. And we only have another one, rinderpest, which is an animal disease. So we have only managed to eradicate 2 infectious diseases so far. We have controlled many more, but this is the first one. And even so, in the last 100 years of existence of this disease, 500 million people died of smallpox. And again, this is a quite recent history still for us. Why these changes? How did that change? When did we start winning this war? So the main thing, the main tool that helped us control diseases was vaccines. And vaccines are probably the most important drug ever invented, very close to antibiotics, because they probably have saved more lives than any other drug in the market. So vaccines started in the 18th century with in the 19th and 20th century having these mass vaccinations that we know. Antibiotics, and here we see Sir Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin in 1928, made a huge change. And remember that the changes in survival and in causes of infection start happening in the first third or in the middle of the 20th century, thanks in great part to antibiotics, with less contributions from antifungals and antivirals, which are newer drugs in terms of these antimicrobiotic drugs. So these against the fungi and the viruses. Antivirals are actually quite a recent drug that have been discovered not so long ago. And the impact, definitely most important impact, is for vaccines and antibiotics. And obviously something that we need to remember is hygiene was very important to make this change, and sanitation and water sanitation and everything that went on starting in the 18th and 19th centuries, that did definitely change the outcome of all these infections. So these are our tools. And we have to remember is how important it is that really vaccines, antibiotics have managed to help us defeat so many diseases and change this outcome of infections that was basically what was killing us for most of our life on this planet. Now, this is not over yet, and this is, I guess, the COVID pandemic made a lot of people realize that actually we are still having problems with microbes, and we are not in any way in control of all infectious diseases. There are many current epidemics that are still huge problems that are sort of hidden. TB, for instance, tuberculosis is one of the most important health challenges we have now, and it's not a lot of people talk about it. But there are 8 million cases worldwide, and it's raising right now. It was a disease that seemed to be controlled, but it's still on the increase. There's not a good vaccine available. That's a problem, and there is good treatment with antibiotics. But the worry is now that there's a huge resistance emerging in tuberculosis. We have a few strains of bacteria that are resistant to almost any drug that we have. And this could turn tuberculosis into a challenging disease in the future. So it could be one of the medical problems that we're going to have even in Europe. This is not a problem only of developing countries. It's something that could happen very close to us if we don't manage to control this emerging resistance. Malaria is a disease that almost nobody talks to in the developing countries, but it's a huge problem in the world. We get around 500 million people infected every year. And with a disease of that has a 10-20% mortality, that means that there's one death in the planet every 30 seconds of malaria. And there is a treatment, and the vaccine, we just eventually managed to get one. But in view, for instance, of what we've seen with the COVID vaccines, that we managed to get the vaccine so fast, I think this is something that we should be considering in the future, whether we can apply the same sort of resources and efforts to try to get rid of diseases that have this huge impact in health in the world. The problem is that since we don't normally see this in developed countries, we don't invest in this, and we don't put as much effort as we put into the COVID vaccines. Malaria, on top of that, is, as you know, transmitted by a mosquito, which acts as a vector. And simple tools like mosquito nets can have a huge incidence and save a lot of lives. So there are tools we don't need sometimes fancy science to fight these diseases. So I think it's important that the whole world becomes aware of these issues that some countries have, and try to help as much we can with even with things like helping the distribution of mosquito nets to save lives. AIDS is it's a current pandemic. It's a pandemic that's been going on for decades, and we still haven't been able to control it. There's more than 30 million infected. There's been already more than 25 million dead from AIDS since the pandemic began in the 80s. We still don't have vaccine, and we've been studying this virus for 40 years, and that is a huge problem. Obviously, is a much more difficult virus to have a vaccine for compared to the COVID. And although we have a good treatment for it that keeps the disease under control, of these antiretroviral drugs, not everyone has access to it. They have side effects, important side effects. They're expensive, and they need to be taken for life. So this is not it's a patch, but it's not the final solution. And again, this is a huge problem in developing countries, and it's something that we should try to find a way to together try to fight this problem and to save all these lives that are lost every year. And finally, flu is something that perhaps we are not thinking as one of the main infectious diseases, one of the main pandemics or epidemics in the world. Flu affects 20% of the population worldwide every year. It's quite an important disease because it can cause up to 500,000 deaths every year, depending on the season. And that's quite a big number. We have a vaccine and we have treatment. So even with a vaccine, we are not managing to control this disease, and we lose 500,000 people every year due to something as simple as a flu, simple in theory. And now finally there was last week some announcement that there is the first steps towards a universal vaccine against flu, which would be much more useful than these vaccines that we have to engineer from scratch every year. And I think that could be a turning point, especially considering that flu, apart from the seasonal flu, we have the pandemics flu. The pandemic flu happens every so often, and we had some important ones in 1918, the Spanish flu that I mentioned before. In 56, we got 2 million people dying of this pandemic version, 1 million in 68, and 500,000 in the last pandemic in 2009. So flu is one of the dangers because the right mutation can turn this virus into a very aggressive pandemic virus. And actually, there has always been the fear that the big pandemic that could affect humanity could be actually a flu pandemic nowadays. So a coronavirus pandemic like the one we are seeing now was not in the cards or was not expected. It was most experts would have bet that the next pandemic would have been a flu pandemic. But as you can see, you never know which virus is going to become pandemic and cause problems. But anyway, we do have a serious situation with flu. So there is quite, and I just showed you 4 examples of very important diseases that right now are causing a lot of deaths in the planet. And are probably even more important than COVID. COVID, we're going to get rid of COVID-19 over the next couple of years, but if not get rid, at least control it. But we're still going to have these 4 diseases roaming wild in the world, perhaps again not affecting much developed countries, and therefore perhaps we're not paying too much attention to it. But these are important challenges of health challenges in the 21st century, and this is not the only thing. As we know from the COVID pandemic, diseases can jump from animals to humans very quickly. And this is what happens. There's a lot of new diseases, new pandemics that have been happening because what we call this zoonosis, this jump from these reservoirs, these viral pools that you see in animals such as pigs and especially bats and other wild animals that can be transferred to humans through contact, or we could say inadequate contact, like the one we see here, or like the one that probably has happened with the coronavirus through bats. There's some examples of these emerging diseases. The most recent or more worrisome ones, like Marburg and Ebola, which are viruses that came from monkeys. Legionella, Lyme disease, AIDS, also another virus that came from monkeys. SARS and COVID are diseases that came from bats. We are more and more invading the habitats of wild animals like bats and destroying their habitats and causing these animals to interact with humans. And therefore, we are importing a lot of viruses that are likely to cause new diseases, new pandemics in the future. And this is something that we need to be aware of. Let's focus now on COVID, which is the main thing that is worrying us. But I thought, again, I wanted to give you a perspective of how COVID fits within the huge fight that we still have with viruses and bacteria. And COVID-19, as you very well know by now, is caused by SARS-CoV-2. It's the name of the final name that was given to the virus, and it was started officially in December 2019 in China. Although it's now been said that it's likely that there were cases not only in China, but probably already outside of China as early as November or even earlier in 2019. So at some point, sometime in 2019, this virus probably emerged from China, escaped from China, and started spreading over the world. The main problem, or one of the main features of this virus, is that it causes a lot of asymptomatic infections. So up to 20% of the people would not have any symptom, and there's quite a long incubation period of a few days after infection that you still don't have symptoms, but you can transmit, you can pass on the disease. That's why it's so highly contagious. It has an R naught of 2 to 3. This is the transmission rate. Is the number of people that an infected person infects. So if for each infected person you get 2 or 3 infected people. So this is in normal conditions without applying any sort of restrictions or any sort of tools to avoid infection. So this virus in the wild would spread at a ratio of 2-3 times for each infected person. As a comparison, flu, which is a very infectious disease, as you can see, it infects 20% of the population every year, has only a 1.3, an R naught of 1.3. So COVID-19 is a much more contagious disease. That's why it has spread so fast. And also, quite importantly, the death rate, which may seem small, of only 1%, is 10 times higher the rate of the flu. Again, these are numbers. The R naught and the death rate are numbers that are still being studied. Depending on the moment, the situation, and the country, this death rate has gone much higher. In older people, it's much higher, but as an average, it's considered now to be between 1 or 2% death rate. And this is giving us a huge amount of victims, of mortal victims of this virus. Because of these high rates of contagion, we had now 71.5 million confirmed cases, and these are figures that I got yesterday. So these are up-to-date figures as much as possible. But in the first wave of the pandemic, it was seen that we were not diagnosing most of the cases. We were only diagnosing 1 in 10 cases. So the actual number of cases of COVID-19 is likely to be much higher, perhaps even as high as 700 million people already, perhaps 10 times higher perhaps not that much, but it could be up to 10 times higher, the confirmed cases. Same thing with the deaths. Right now, we already passed 1.5 million. This is definitely much worse than any seasonal pandemic of flu, seasonal flu, sorry. And as you remember, the maximum deaths that we see by flu every year is around 500,000. We're already 3 times over that. And again, this is only confirmed deaths. This is probably not the actual real figure of death. Is probably much higher. At least some people estimate that it's at least double this amount, the actual number of deaths caused by coronaviruses. If you look at the cumulative death rates per million people, per million inhabitants, as you can see, there's some countries that have done especially poorly, and we are up here with the top more than 1,000 per million of a death rate. In most of Europe, in most of Western Europe, we've done quite poorly. UK being one of them, Spain, where I'm from, also doing very poorly. US doing as poorly as we did. Parts of South America in the same condition. But as you can see, there are many countries that have done much better than us. So it's not impossible, actually, to get this disease under control. Southeast Asia, they managed to keep this the pandemic under control very well. There's Uruguay down here that is an example of it's a relatively small country, but they managed to keep the COVID-19 at bay using very cheap and tools, using more imagination than anything else. And there's obviously the example of New Zealand being one of the countries that best managed to control the disease. So we definitely have not done our job properly here in Europe, and the rate is really much higher than it should have been if we had prepared well and we had reacted well to this virus. And remember that the pandemic is not over yet, so we're still going to see these numbers increasing over time. As I was saying that before, the mortality is probably higher than we expected, because we are only counting the actual official deaths by COVID. But it's much more interesting to look at excess mortality. Excess mortality is basically what you do is you calculate, you see the rate of death above the average of the previous 5 years. So mortality over the months of a year is more or less stable, or at least has been stable in developed countries over the past years. So if you take the average of the last 5 years and you compare it with the deaths that you've seen this year, if you look, for instance, at UK in red, there is around the first peak of the pandemic, there is a 100% increase in deaths. That means that the double the amount of people that are normally dying were dying over this time. So that means that all these excess death needs to be marked as COVID-19 deaths, whether direct or indirect. Indirect deaths should also count as part of victims of this pandemic. People like, for instance, were not going to hospitals because of the fear of getting infected, and they would die at home of perhaps of acute diseases that could have been treated in the hospital successfully in any other time. So I would count those as well as victims of the pandemic. If you look at Spain, this is probably one of the countries that did the worst during the first peak, with an excess mortality of 140%. So that's a huge amount increase over the normal rate of death in the country. And you see that the most recent data is mid and late November. There's still an excess mortality in Spain and United States and some other countries, while others, and we use Norway here as an example of a country in Europe that managed to control the pandemic very well. These guys basically have stayed very close to 0% excess death. So the rate of death is nothing compared to the absurd levels that we've seen in Spain, especially, but as well in the UK and the US. 3 examples of 3 countries that have done very poorly in managing this disease. Now, the problem with COVID-19 is that we don't have a lot of tools at the moment. There's no useful antivirals. There's no drugs that can stop this virus. Chloroquine was discussed at the beginning as one of the drugs that could work. Eventually was shown that it didn't have any effect. Remdesivir, again, is an antiviral that is supposed to stop the viral replication. It seemed to work. There's some studies that show it works. Right now, the WHO has issued a statement saying that the remdesivir is not a drug of choice and is not actually doing much in COVID. Right now, we're talking about convalescent plasma, so basically plasma from people that have survived the disease and therefore would have quite a lot of antibodies against the virus. You can sort of make a transfusion of this plasma to very sick people, and hopefully this could help fight the virus. There's these monoclonal antibodies that people like Donald Trump also got for treating the COVID. These are all question marks at the moment. There's not a single drug that has been shown to stop, convincingly at least, to stop the progression of the virus. And the only things we are left with is drugs like dexamethasone, which is an anti-inflammatory that can stop inflammation and improves much the survival in the most severe cases. It's not a drug that stops the virus, but it stops the huge inflammation that you see in response to this virus. Also, anti-clotting drugs, because blood clotting seems to be one of the issues, one of the tools that this, or one of the consequences that this virus causes, and is probably also one of the causes of death. So perhaps using anti-clotting drugs is justified, and it could save some lives. And obviously, we're all waiting for the vaccines, and this is the final tool that probably is going to help us stop this pandemic. It's very unlikely that we're going to find in time a good antiviral that stops viral replication. All the efforts so far have been a failure. We see some very mild effects in some of these drugs, but none of them seems to be good enough to be given globally all over the world. And we are basically relying now, the only other option we have is the vaccines. So let's finally just talk a bit about the vaccines, which is what you guys want to hear about. And later we can discuss this a bit more and talk about the use and the qualities of these vaccines. I got this information again yesterday, so it's up to date until yesterday from this website. So if you go to the New York Times, they have probably the best infographic that I've seen and most up to date for tracking the vaccines. So if you check this website, you would get up to date information. And what you see here is the vaccines that are more advanced in the different phases of the clinical trials. And as you can see here, there has been already 41 vaccines in phase 1 clinical studies, the initial phase of the clinical studies. Out of these, 16 went into phase 2 and 16 now in phase 3. And these are sort of the 3 phases of any clinical study. And already 5 of them have been approved for early or limited use, and 2 have been approved for actually full use. And out of all these, there's already 1 that has been abandoned. There's a vaccine in Australia that for some reason that is not known, gave a false positive in AIDS tests for people that got vaccinated. So it's not clear why a vaccine against COVID would give you a positive in an AIDS test, but that sort of got everybody scared, and this vaccine basically was quickly abandoned. But we have these around 40-something vaccines already in clinical trials, and we have around 150 more that are in preclinical trials. So there's a lot of vaccines coming up, and chances are that more than one are going to be good. So let's review in a bit more detail what's coming up and which vaccines are they. Starting with these 5 approved by limited use, these are the vaccines that the Russian and the Chinese approved quite quickly while they were still in phase 2 or starting phase 3. So these are vaccines that you could say have not gone through the actual full testing process. And these are vaccines that should raise some eyebrows. You should be careful about these vaccines because they have not followed the actual proper path of research that guarantees that the vaccine is, or as much as you can, it guarantees that the vaccine is safe. Nevertheless, these vaccines have been approved for limited use in China and Russia and have been given already to probably hundreds of thousands of people. We have no data for this. We don't know actually what sort of reactions have been happening, what sort of protection has been happening. There's quite an obscure area, and there's very little information coming out of these countries, as normally happens on these 5 vaccines. So the vaccines are the CanSino in China, Sinovac and Sinopharm in China as well, and the two from Russia, the Gamaleya and the Vector Institute, again, which were approved actually perhaps more than a month ago to be used in these countries. The ones that are more interesting for us are these two, these approved. These are the ones that are, in theory, going through all the needed process to actually be sure this vaccine does what it's supposed to be doing. Mostly, this is the one that everybody knows. And here, sorry, I forgot to mention that here we have in this list, we have the 12 most advanced vaccines, the ones that probably we're going to see in the market first. And one of them is actually the one that we are getting here in the UK, the Pfizer-BioNTech. And the other vaccine that has approved for full use is another one of the Chinese, the Sinopharm from Beijing, that is approved for use only in the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. So it's one of these vaccines, again, that perhaps didn't fully complete the phase 3 studies and was already approved by limited use, like the other 5 that we saw before. But apart from that, this jumped into this next category because it has actually been approved in 2 countries already. Again, the data from this vaccine is not available. It's not very clear whether this vaccine has gone through all the testing as it should. So at the moment, in Europe, at least, we're going to be focusing on the Pfizer vaccine, which is the first one that has been approved. As you can see in this map, it has been approved for full use in Canada and for emergency use in the UK and the US and also Saudi Arabia and some countries here in Arabia. So there's the only vaccine I would say that we are going to see now in Europe and in North America. The difference between full use and emergency use, it's a technical one. It's in the UK, in the US, for instance, it allowing the emergency use, it sped up the process, so allowed to do the last steps of the approval quicker. But in practical terms, full and emergency in this context would be quite equivalent. And in theory, here we're calling it emergency use, but we're using it as for all the population with no other problems. But it is a technical, bureaucratical issue because we managed to get it approved in the UK before in Europe, because we invoked this sort of emergency use that allowed the UK to bypass the European, the EU regulation, which the UK still being part of the EU until January, we should have waited until the EU approved it. But since we called it an emergency situation, then we managed to get it ahead of the rest of Europe for a few weeks. The other one that was saying that was approved is, again, only approved in limited places and has this sort of emergency use in China. And again, is a vaccine that we have very few data for this vaccine, the Sinopharm vaccine, and we don't know exactly what characteristics and what safety and effects this vaccine would have. And an important thing now, so we've seen which vaccines we have almost ready, these 12 vaccines that are very close to the final stages, the 2 of them that are in theory already approved, the 5 that are more or less approved in certain places. Now let's look at what kinds of vaccines we're talking about. And again, all the vaccines, these 12 and all the other 150 that are being developed, they all fall within these 4 groups that I'm going to show you now. The most common type of vaccine, this is the vaccines that we've been using forever, and then that since very early on in the vaccinations have been based on inactivated or attenuated viruses. And this was, again, a classic way of preparing vaccines. So it was one of the first that it was attempted. And as you can see, the Chinese, 3 of the Chinese vaccines are using this classic inactivated or attenuated virus. What you do here is you get one of the coronavirus, you weaken it with chemicals, or you basically kill it, and we inject this inactivated virus. Now, this in theory would not cause the disease, but would cause the reaction, would cause the immunization. Now, some experts have been saying that this is not the best way to make a vaccine for coronavirus, because a percentage of these inactivated viruses can cause the disease themselves. So part, we see it, for instance, with the polio. Poliomyelitis is a disease, a very serious disease that it's almost eradicated from the world, but we still see some polio caused by the vaccine itself. It's a different form, it's a different version, but some of vaccines can use with this sort of attenuated viruses can cause the disease that they're trying to prevent. So that's why it was thought that in a disease as contagious as this one, it would be better to use other techniques. And this is what we've been doing with the other three methods. The second one would be the protein-based, and this is actually another method that has been tried and tested and used a lot in the past. So there are several vaccines that use this system. And the Novavax in the US and the one in Russia have already been developed using this, again, classic approach. But I think what's interesting in the whole business of the COVID vaccine is the fact that we managed to get to the final stages two techniques that have been developed over the past decades. Actually, some of them started in the 80s and 90s, so they've been around for a long time, but it never really managed to get to the final stage and get into mass vaccination like we're seeing now. And this influx of money, this amount of effort that we have put into developing vaccines for COVID has allowed us to finish developing these techniques and basically create vaccines using different approaches that could help us avoid some of the side effects that these classic vaccines may have. Now, one of them is the viral vector, and this is the one that we are doing in the UK. So the Oxford vaccine is based on an adenoviral vector, as well as the Russian vaccine that has been approved, and again, a Chinese one, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is one that is already in phase 3 and very close as well to being approved. Now, how does this work? Basically, what you do is you get another vector, another virus, and perhaps a virus that doesn't work in humans, or any sort of virus that you can safely inject in humans, and you insert the genetic code for the protein that you want to use, you want to generate the antibodies against. So this bit of genetic information would be from the coronavirus, and the vector that you have outside would be a different virus. And again, this is a clever way to deliver DNA that has been actually researched a lot in the context of gene therapy. Things like this have been used in gene therapy. So it's based on principles that have been around for quite a few decades. And the one that everybody's been talking about these past weeks is the one that's been used by Pfizer and also by Moderna, which is a vaccine that's already under review by the FDA in the US and is likely to be approved in the next days or weeks. And is this what we call the genetic vaccines, which is a completely new development. And we never before had these genetic vaccines available. That what they do is either encapsulate in some sort of a lipidic nanoparticle a bit of the RNA of the virus. You get the gene of the virus, or any way that you can think of delivering this particular bit of the viral genome into the body. Then this would enter our cells. Our cells would start making this viral protein, and then we will get this immune response. Now, this is interesting because, this has been possible because very early on, we managed to identify which was the target that we needed to use for designing the vaccines. As I said before, we still haven't managed to design a vaccine against AIDS, mostly because we don't know which target to use. We don't know which protein of the virus or which element of the virus can give a good immune response, because the AIDS virus, the HIV, is very variable. It changes completely very often. So we cannot get a lock into one of the conformation of these proteins. We've been very lucky with the coronavirus, and this is why we've been so quick at developing a vaccine, because very early on we found a protein that is very stable and can produce an immune response. And this is the protein that has been used in this protein-based, the spike protein of the coronavirus, like you see here, is the one that has been used in most of these protein-based vaccines, and is also the genetic information that has been used in the genetic vaccines to sort of make produce this viral protein in our cells and generate that response. So part of the reason why we've been so quick at developing the vaccine is that because we had a good target early on, and also because we had techniques that are new and are much quicker, and these techniques were ready to be used, or almost ready to be used. And we managed to get these vaccines much faster. As you can see, the genetic vaccines have been faster to developing than the actual classic vaccines, which take a much sometimes longer route. Right, and just to finish, and a bit what Elena was saying in the beginning, that is something that it's quite important, that we invested a lot of money, we invested a lot of time and effort and resources in developing a vaccine. We're going to have several good vaccines for COVID. We're going to have, more importantly, new technology that we can use in future vaccines developed thanks to COVID. But the problem is that we need to convince people that these vaccines are safe, useful, and necessary. Otherwise, this is not going to work. Because the worst vaccine is basically the vaccine that people don't trust. So if we don't get people to trust these vaccines, we are in a tough situation. And the mistrust that we're seeing in the general public, I think, is justified, because we did something much quicker than we've done previously. And this is something that needs to be explained, like I just said before, why we managed to get so fast, because this virus is very stable, because we found the target very early on, because we invested a huge amount of money and hours of man hours into this research. And then because we had some new technology ready to be applied to this is why, and then we got as many corners as we could, but we didn't cut any time of the actual safety measurements. So we did the phase 1, 2, and 3 as they normally are done. And this vaccine has the one that has been approved, at least, has gone through all the steps that any other vaccine we had in the past has gone through. As an example, the Ebola vaccine that was approved very recently after the recent outbreak in Africa was approved after clinical trials in less than 3,000 people. Now, the clinical trials for these vaccines that are now in the market at least had 50,000 people, or 20 or 1,000, or depending on which group you look. But it had tens of thousands of volunteers. So this is a vaccine that has gone through the steps that you would expect for any normal vaccine. We cannot say anything. We cannot say the same for the Chinese or the Russian vaccines, because we have no data for that. And I think that this is one of the causes that also fuels this mistrust, is the fact that there are some very opaque, very hidden sort of processes happening in some countries that generate more of this mistrust. And the fact that some of these vaccines were approved for use for political reasons, mostly because the Russia and China wanted to be the first to claim that they had a vaccine in the market. I think that is scary, and it causes cause of concern in many people. So I think this needs to be addressed properly, and this needs to be separated from the vaccines that we are getting approved in Europe and in America, which are going through the actual process of control as they normally are. And then now, if you want, we can discuss the uncertainties of these vaccines and the things that we still don't know about these vaccines, and how this could affect the future of the vaccine. I'm going to stop here and hear your commentaries. I just want to do this shameless plug of my book, which is coming up in March. So if you are interested about these topics, everything that I discussed today and many more things are being fully discussed in this book. And those of you interested in epidemics and infectious diseases are probably going to have a good time reading this book. And yeah, I'm be very happy to hear your questions and engage in a discussion about these topics. Thank you very much for listening.
Dr. Macip, thank you so much for that talk. That was really informative. We've already got a few questions coming in, but guys, keep them coming. If you have any more, message either me or Vikram. So, Dr. Macip, the first question we've got is from Megan. She's asking, whether you know if they've found any differences between the people that they've vaccinated who have already had corona, and if there's been any differences between them and those that haven't, that have been vaccinated.
It's a very good point, and this is one of the questions that this vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, still is raising, and the others that are now nearing the end of the clinical trials. The clinical trials that have been done do not answer very important questions. This is one of them. Another one is, for instance, the protection that we're going to see in the elderly. Most of the volunteers in the clinical trials are between 14 and 70. You don't get old, and you don't get children either. So we don't know how these extreme populations are going to react. And these are quite important, especially the old, because these are the ones that are getting vaccinated first. So there are some gaps in our knowledge. And it has been said, and as you know, I mean, the response to the virus is very heterogeneous. So this means that some people would react very mildly, some people would die of the virus. There's a huge spectrum of responses, and the immunological response is similar. Some people would not get almost antibodies generated by the infection. Some people will get a lot of antibodies generated. So having survived COVID-19 is not a guarantee that you're going to get, that you have a good protection against the virus. That's why we're seeing reinfections, and it's been now confirmed that you can be reinfected in some situations. It seems rare at the moment, but some people would have not developed a full immunity against the virus after the first infection. That's why it's been recommended that everybody should get the vaccine regardless of whether they went through the disease or not. Now, whether this is going to affect how the vaccine works or not, that's a good question, and we don't know. If you are thinking about perhaps a negative response, like perhaps an exaggerated immune response to the vaccine, this has not been observed. And in theory, during the clinical trials, we should have seen some of this. I don't think there's reasons now to believe that people that have passed have survived COVID should be worried about getting the vaccine. It looks like still a recommendation that is something that it could be that they should take, and it could be useful.
Thank you for that answer. A question that has come up loads of times is that what are the best ways of tackling the anti-vaccine opinions within the UK associated with the Pfizer vaccine? And we're kind of linking that into what would you say to conspiracy theory believers who think the vaccine, the virus has been manufactured, and then also linking that into how can we reassure, family, friends around us to, take the vaccine? Because as you said, the worst vaccine is the one that people don't take.
Yeah, I think this is a key topic, and it's a very important thing. And I've been, the past 7 or 8 months, I've been basically fighting the anti-vaxxers and the people that are not, trying to, more than fighting, I think the word is trying to convey the message, or to inform these people. So there's 2 different kinds of people that would not want to put the vaccine, want to get this vaccine. So some of them are those that will not be convinced otherwise. So no matter how much effort you put into explaining the vaccine, these people are not going to change their minds. And these are people usually that are ill-informed, that they don't go to the right sources of information. Perhaps they don't have enough training or enough knowledge or enough education to process the information properly. And these people are very difficult to convince, and most likely you're not going to convince them. And then there's a fraction of the population, and some of them probably among you guys that are well-informed, that are people that are at the university level, that know what they're talking about, but they still have doubts. Now, this is the target audience that we can address. That we can really, I wouldn't say convince, but show the data and let people make their own decisions. So my approach, at least, to people that doubt the vaccine, first of all, these doubts are perfectly normal. So you don't have to dismiss the fear and the mistrust that the vaccine generates. It's perfectly normal to not trust something that has been thrust upon us so quickly. I think this is a legitimate doubt that we all have. Now, this has to be counteracted with the sort of information that I gave. These are vaccines that, yes, have been done very fast, but we cut the corners where we could. So actually, it's the opposite. By this, we discovered that our process of making vaccines was very inefficient. So we spent a lot of time, all the vaccines that we developed so far we spend more time than we should with those vaccines, which we could have been much faster, because there's a lot of steps that could have been done faster. And actually, one of the steps that we cut more corners is the bureaucracy. There's a lot of bureaucracy in approval of vaccines. Now, in a normal situation, the report of this vaccine would have been given to the FDA or to the any organism, and it would spend months on the desk waiting for a turn to be reviewed. And now what we do is that we put this report at the top of the pile, because we want it approved very fast. So if we want, we can skip some time there. So there's certain steps that could be optimized, and we have optimized them. And we have not been doing it too fast in terms of the safety regulations. Every single drug that gets into the market, vaccines or not vaccines, in history, you don't have 100% of the answers. You don't have 100% warranty that this drug is going to be safe. But this goes from aspirin to a new cancer drug, everything. We do as much as we can in the clinical trials, but there's always gaps in the knowledge, because you can not know what's going to happen when you give a drug to 1 million people, because you don't have clinical trials with 1 million. You cannot have 1 million volunteers in a clinical trial. So there's always going to be this 1 in a million thing that you're not going to see until you start giving it to the population. This is what we call the phase 4. So it's this phase in which, after the 3 phases and you start commercializing this drug, you're still looking and making sure that there are no complications. And this is important as well. And we saw some adverse reactions to the people that got vaccinated. There were 2 people that reacted badly because they had allergies. So this is good. We managed to detect these cases very quickly. This shows that we are paying attention, that if there's something wrong happening, we're going to see it right away. And I think these are things that we need to reinforce, the idea. This is always the how we do it. There are drugs that, when the drugs get to the market, we never have all the answers, and we still keep looking and keep an eye for this. I think it would be my way of approaching this. And most importantly, I think when you have to convince one of your relatives that doesn't believe in vaccines, or a friend or something, what you cannot is laugh at this thing, or dismiss, saying, "Oh, you're just stupid. Why don't you believe in vaccines?" That's not the way to approach it, because again, the doubts and the fears that these vaccines are generating are perfectly legitimate. Now, if they start talking about whether Bill Gates are putting microchips in the vaccines to control you, then that's a step too far. Maybe that's an easy one to say, yeah, well, perhaps not. But if you have an issue, a legitimate issue about this vaccine, I don't trust it because it has been done so fast, then you can start discussing, okay, let's review the process. It has been done fast, yes, but the important steps are there. And this is not worse in any way compared to any other vaccine that we had in the past. Actually, some of the data is much more solid and it's more complete. And we have the whole world watching. So we're going to see if something wrong happens, if something has eluded us in this clinical trial. That would be my approach to people that are doubting the vaccines.
So Dr. Macip, would you say, so the thing that people are most worried about is the side effects of the vaccine? They're worried, that's what they're worried about. So we know that there have been 2 cases of anaphylaxis so far to the Pfizer vaccine. So have there been any other concerns about, say, pregnant women or those who are immunosuppressed, or like, what are we worried about here?
Yeah, this actually, for pregnant women and immunosuppressed would be the same problem as any other vaccine. And that's why we're trying to reach herd immunity, because there's a certain part of the population that you're not going to be able to vaccinate. There's some people that will not be able to get the vaccine. Immunosuppressed people are probably unlikely to get the vaccine. So they're going to have to rely on herd immunity. Pregnant women, we have no data because you're never going to have a trial with pregnant women. So it's likely, it's thinking about what the vaccine is, which is a bit of RNA, it's very unlikely that this would have any effect on the embryo. But even so, I'm guessing that they're going to try to not give it to pregnant women as much as you can, just in case, just to be extra safe. And yes, the main issue, I think, for the vaccine, the main worry is the side effects. Vaccines, these ones, the ones that seem to be getting near the end or being approved, they say they have a protection of 90% or effectivity of 95%, something that it's a huge number. The flu vaccine that we use every season has it ranges from 15 to 60%, and we consider it okay, and we still give that vaccine even though the protection it gives is very poor. So we're not worried so much about how effective it is. We're worried about the side effects, especially a vaccine that you're going to give to millions to thousands of millions of people. You want to make sure that you don't get any serious side effects. Now, the two reactions that we've seen, there are pseudo anaphylactic reactions. They didn't go into full anaphylactic shock. All of them recovered, and these were patients that had a history of already previous anaphylactic reactions, and they already carried the EpiPen with the epinephrine injection. So this is not the average population or the average allergic. So there will be very few people that actually have these sort of reactions, and they would already know probably, and they will be ready for that sort of things. So for any of us that are allergic to whatever, to dogs, for instance, I'm allergic to dogs, I'm not particularly worried that this is going to affect me in any way in this vaccine. And I think that obviously, yes, it forces us to be extremely vigilant in people with extreme reactions, but now we know, and we're probably going to be ready. And again, these two people recovered fully, it looks like, so we should be okay.
I've got a slightly political question that's come in, which I thought was quite interesting. It links in with, firstly, the differences in vaccines and how they're produced and their structures. So are the mRNA vaccines acting as like a gap filler until the other vaccines, like the Oxford one, is approved? As the mRNA vaccine, of course, has to mix with saline, certain temperature. How are we going to get them out to care homes? And then link that into, well, EU tensions and the ever dooming no deal Brexit happening push us right to the bottom of the pile for the best vaccines, inverted comma best vaccines, when they come out?
Yeah, I think those are very good questions, and I think we are going to see some of these. I mean, what happened in the UK, the approval of this vaccine, it has a political angle for sure, and it's Brexit related. I mean, clearly, Boris Johnson wanted to send a message to the EU saying, okay, we can do things on our own, and we can do it much faster than you guys. And again, this is only the bureaucratic part. I mean, the EU hasn't approved this vaccine because they're meeting in 2 weeks, and it's difficult. It's more difficult, I guess, to get all the experts together to meet to review the case in Europe than in the UK, that you can do it quickly all together in London, perhaps. So there's been this was a political card that was played here, and yes, there is that factor. We're going to have a problem in January the 1st because this vaccine comes from Germany. And they're saying that the route of this vaccine from Germany now to, or Belgium, actually, I think there's some factories coming into the UK, is going to be much more complicated once Brexit starts in January. So we could very well be, as you say, at the bottom of the list once the new year starts. And that's perhaps why we were hurrying to get some before the Brexit is implemented. But it's interesting, the idea of, is this the actual good vaccine for the COVID, or is this just some sort of stopgap until we get the actual good one? I think we're not going to know until this actually happens. Perhaps the perfect COVID vaccine is not going to be the first or the second or the third. Perhaps it's going to be the fourth one. I think we're going to see more than one good vaccine, and vaccines that can be applied in different conditions. It could be that there are vaccines that are more effective in older people, and we're going to see that when we start vaccinating these people, I guess. There are going to be vaccines that are going to be much easier to shift and to move around. Obviously, the Pfizer vaccine has a huge problem with this -80 situation, that you have to keep this freeze chain through the whole procedure. It makes this vaccine, it would be impossible to give it to remote areas. I'm thinking perhaps even in Africa. How do you give this vaccine in Africa? There's no way you can keep the temperatures down for so long. So probably there are other vaccines that are going to be better in those situations. I think we're going to start 2021 with more than one vaccine approved, and the first two are RNA based, but the third one is already the vector based, and there's going to be a different condition. So I'm guessing that it's going to be a combination of more than one vaccine being used for different in different situations. Which one is going to be the best one? Which one is going to be the good one? We don't know which one is going to be the most effective one. We really don't know. And it could be very well that the Pfizer one is the best and is the first one that we got. We don't really know until we actually see. So I think we're going to have to wait a few months for a verdict on that.
And then linking that in, something that Elena and me have talked about quite extensively with other people as well, is the financials behind it and the funding behind the vaccines. You know, different governments having interests, but something that we were told that poorer nations, compared to us, would have to pay for these vaccines. You know, a huge proportion of money as well. And Elena, do you want to expand a bit more into that?
Yeah, actually, it's not only the problem of money, it's a political issue. So it started, I mean, the vaccines are going to follow probably the same example that we saw with the tests. I mean, the tests are critical to control the peaks of the disease. And African countries had no access to the tests because Europe and America and richer countries in Asia basically were just hoarding all the tests. It's not that they couldn't afford it. I mean, there's African countries that have enough money to buy these tests, but they couldn't even get into the list because we were buying them all. There was not enough tests being produced to serve everybody, so African countries were just left out of the list. With the vaccines, we're seeing the same thing. Canada reserved 5 times the amounts of vaccines that the population. So you have 5 vaccines per 5 doses of vaccine per habitant in Canada. Europe is doing the same. Well, not 5, but we're going to have reserved at least more vaccines that we are going to be able to use. The US is going to go first. Obviously, the vaccines that are being made in the US wants priority over those. The ones being made in Europe wants priority over those. China is going to have priority over their vaccines, and so on. So in the end, this leaves a good chunk of the planet without coverage. So basically, they're saying that we are getting the vaccine now. Most of us in the UK are likely to be able to be vaccinated within the first half of the year if nothing goes wrong and if the supply keeps being steady. But most of Africa is unlikely to get a vaccine until 2022. So this is quite worrying because there's going to be a lot of people dying. And a lot of people, a lot of viruses still circulating in a lot of countries due to our poor management, our inability to have a common strategy and to distribute these vaccines equally or at least rationally. There was this initiative from the WHO called COVAX, which was a program that was supposed to unite all the countries into one single entity, saying, okay, we are going to buy the vaccines, and then we, from COVAX, are going to distribute the vaccines to whoever needs it the most. So everybody signed up for those. But in the moment of truth, everybody sort of bypassed COVAX and reserved the vaccines for their own. So COVAX has a ridiculous amount of vaccines reserved, while the rest of Europe and North America have like all the production that these companies are going to be able to produce in the next 8, 9, 10 months are already reserved there. So we failed miserably at trying to build a program that could cover the whole world. And this is a problem. Yeah, it's a political problem, it's an economical problem that I think we need to seriously address.
And just to add into that, how do you think we could best address it? So I've just used the green screen as well to share a link I found on Twitter for some action where people can petition and send mails, call Pfizer and all these companies to make it widely available, because that's the purpose of a vaccine. As you said, if it's not widely distributed, it defeats its purpose, and the efficacy, no matter how good it is on paper, won't be as good as it should be. And nowadays with international travel and everything, but what else can we do from, just being citizens, apart from sending these letters? How do you think we can best kind of campaign for this to happen?
Well, the frustrating thing is that we don't have a lot of power in this, and apart from doing that and complaining, and for instance, I try to do this and write about it and talk about it in the media because I have that option. You guys can talk to your family and post online, talk on Twitter. That's as much noise as we can generate. I think that's the only way to address this problem, because it's not only, I think the problem is not only the companies. The companies don't really care who gets the vaccine. They just get the money after it. So it's fine if they sell it to Nigeria or they sell it to, I don't know, Switzerland. This is, for them, that makes no difference. It's the power of the countries, the geopolitical power behind this, that it's really driving this market of vaccines. So it's the countries just trying to show who's stronger and who has more power and who can get more vaccines. And it's a problem when we have part of the population that plays that game. If you think about the US, You have 71 million people voting for Donald Trump, which is actually selling that sort of America first mentality. How do you fight this back saying, no, it's not America first, it's the human race first. We have to deal with humanity as a whole. This is a pandemic. Pandemic means that the whole world is in it. We're all in the same problem. So we have to solve this problem from the top. I mean, just getting everybody covered. But there's half of the population, at least in the US as an example, that would just believe the opposite. So we say, no, let's get our people vaccinated first. Then we can see if we can get some vaccination in the rest of the world. It's very difficult because it's not a global sentiment, a global feeling. It's not everybody is going to agree with that. And there's too many geopolitical powers in play that are going to make this very difficult. I may be a bit cynical about it and maybe negative about it, but I still think that we need to fight. I definitely try to raise my voice, saying as much as I can, saying that this is completely wrong. And we may be late for this pandemic, but for the next pandemic, perhaps, can we just prepare better? Can we just think more rationally about how we do this?
And I wanted to ask as well, I don't know if this has been asked in the comments, but is there a life limit to this vaccine? Because I've heard of new strains as well coming up. How long do you think it's going to be useful? And how useful is it for these countries to overstock on something that might not be useful in a few months' time?
Yeah, I think this is an issue that's been on the table in the past days since this new strain has been identified in the UK, actually. So it's the strain that we see the most. I think we shouldn't worry too much about this at the moment. I mean, the answer to your question is we don't know. We don't know how long these vaccines are going to last, how long the protection is going to last, because we haven't had these vaccines around for long enough to understand whether they're going to cover you for a few months or for a year or for a few years or maybe forever. We can only guess based on what we know of other coronaviruses, how they evolve. And the coronaviruses are viruses that are very stable. Again, they're just sort of the opposite of the HIV. These are viruses that they do mutate. All viruses are going to mutate, but these mutations we are seeing are very minor. And we've seen a few already. I mean, there was the sort of the strain that was circulating in Europe after the summer was first seen in Spain. So there was this theory that was saying that people going on vacation in Spain brought the viruses back to their countries, and that's how it spread. That variant, that strain spread, and that was the predominant strain in Europe. Now in the UK, there's another strain that is predominant, but all these different strains have a very, very small variations. And even though this last one seems to affect the target protein, it doesn't seem like it's changing it too much, or it's making the virus behave differently. The virus doesn't seem more aggressive, or doesn't seem particularly more worrying than other strains of the viruses. If that holds, we should be okay. And I think the way other coronaviruses have been known to evolve over the past years, it looks like this virus is likely to stay pretty much stable in the next months and in perhaps years. So I would say that it's likely that this vaccine is going to give us coverage for a long time. Now, whether we're going to have to revaccinate again later on, maybe. But if we manage to cover enough percentage of the world population fast enough, we should be able to bring this pandemic down to outbreak level, to only local levels, because the virus is not going to be able to spread as quickly if you have a good percentage of the population vaccinated. If you get to that point, it's going to be much easier to control. Even though let's say our immunity goes down after a few months, by then the virus should be sort of kicked out of a country with a good herd immunity. And if we are careful, we're not going to get it back in, and we should be more or less okay. So the pandemic could be much easier to control if we get to that point. But yeah, obviously, we would wish to have the longest protection possible with this vaccine. But this we're really not going to know until we start after a few months of giving the vaccine. And again, it could be that some vaccines would give you much better immunity and much lasting immunity compared to other vaccines. We're not going to know until probably next year or the next one.
Kathy just told me maybe we might aim to stop questions at 8, if that's okay, and if you're happy to take some questions by email to answer them, hopefully to try educate people, prepare them for that Christmas family meal, and then we can start the debate if that's okay with everyone.
we've had a question a lot of people have asked. So with the flu vaccine, I don't know if this is known, or maybe you could just answer it in your professional opinion. But does it mean that if you have the flu vaccine, does that mean that you can't pass it on to you can't pass the flu on to other people? And is that applicable to the COVID vaccine as well?
That's an essential question, and this is very important because it's very different to be protected against the disease or to not be infective. That's two different things, because what we would need now is to make sure that you cannot infect somebody else. I mean, obviously you would like not to die of the disease, so try to be protected, that's good. But even more important socially is that you're not transmitting the disease. The flu vaccine doesn't work like this, no? The flu vaccine, most of the times actually, it protects you against the disease, but you can still pass it on. It can still be contagious. Looks like in the COVID, we don't know. We don't know the answer yet. So the clinical studies done so far show protection against the disease, but they don't show whether you are not infectious anymore. So it's very likely, by the way this vaccine works and comparing to other vaccines, that these vaccines are going to give us protection. So we're not going to have a severe form of the disease or a disease at all, but we're still going to have the virus inside, and we may be able to spread the virus to other people. Obviously, if the vaccine is good enough, it would keep the replication of the virus at very low levels. So the possibility of infecting other people is going to be low as well. So we're not going to be as infectious as normally as non-vaccinated people. But I think what this means, I mean, and again, this is an unknown area at the moment. We don't know yet if this is going to be the case. But what people are saying now, experts are saying that the likely scenario is that we're still going to have to use face masks and distance and hand washing for quite a long time, just to be sure, even though we are vaccinated, because we may be okay, but we may be still transmitting the virus to other people because the vaccine is probably not going to stop that. Although it may reduce the levels of virus in your body, you could still potentially infect other people. So, but again, it's one of the questions that we have at the moment.
And kind of linking into that, we've had about 7 or 8 questions about the long-term effects. So I'll put a scenario through. So let's say we've got a 20-year-old individual. Given that we can't be certain of the long-term effects in terms of, could the mRNA vaccine, knock on to a cell cycle gene, wouldn't it be sensible to vaccinate from a certain population age upwards, but then let younger people contract the virus by themselves? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, this is an issue that's been discussed from very early on in the pandemic. If you remember, the first strategy from Boris Johnson was let young people get infected and let's protect only old people. This has been shown to be a mistake. I mean, it's on paper, it's a good idea. So yeah, I mean, so the people that are going to die are going to be older people. Let's protect the older people and leave the young ones live normally, and they will get infected and they will get the herd immunity on their own. This doesn't work for many reasons. First of all, it's impossible to isolate the susceptible population, the old people. You cannot completely isolate them. I mean, if you could send them all to the moon, maybe yes, maybe you could protect them. But otherwise, these people are going to interact with young people. So they still, even though if you protect them as well as you can, they're still going to get infected. When it gets to the vaccine, maybe that's different. But the situation we discussed so far is let's try to isolate all people and frail people and let the others live normally. That wouldn't work in that sense because you cannot isolate this population completely. And even more importantly, there's a certain percentage of deaths in all ages. So any of us can die of this disease. I mean, it's less frequent for us than for an 80-year-old, but we could still die of the disease. And one thing that is not mentioned normally is the side effects of this disease. First of all, we don't know the long-term side effects of the disease. There's people that still have not recovered, that were infected 3 or 4 months ago and have not recovered. And these are young, healthy people that have not recovered fully. There's neurological damage that we don't really know for sure what's happening. Some people seem like the nerves are getting affected. Some people lost the sense of smell and taste, and they still haven't recovered. I mean, it may seem trivial next to dying of the disease, but if you, I know somebody that was working as a chef. He was working in a restaurant and he cannot smell. So basically, that guy has his life ruined if he cannot get this back at some point. So there's all these side effects, long-term side effects, lung fibrosis in people that had serious responses. The side effects that we don't know. I have a good friend of mine that he's healthy young guy in his 40s, running marathons, got the COVID and was very close to dying. He spent months in the hospital and still gets tired by walking up the stairs. So is this guy going to recover? And this is a young, healthy guy. So I don't think we can risk it. I don't think any of us can risk getting this disease. For most of us, if we get it, it's going to be mild, it's true. But there's a percentage that is going to suffer acutely or chronically. And I don't think we can make that gamble. It's not ethical to make that gamble and let people get infected. And there's an example of what happened in a city in Brazil, in Manaus, in the Amazonia. It is the capital of the Amazonas. And it's a city where it basically they failed in the containment of the virus. And they managed to get herd immunity. So now there's like a 75% herd immunity in the city, the highest in the world. So 75% of the population have antibodies against the virus. So they were protected. But the consequences of that is that over these months, a lot of people died. This has the highest percentage of death in the world. I mean, can we pay that price? Can we say, okay, let's let some people die so we can all get herd immunity? I think that's ethically and socially and politically not an option. Now, when it comes to vaccines, I think we need to apply more or less the same idea. We need to be sure that we protect as many people as we can. We need to protect the elderly first, it's true. But again, we don't know first how good is going to be this vaccine for the elderly, because the olds, we haven't really studied them. So we need to protect them, we need to basically protect everybody. I don't think we can escape this. We cannot say, okay, let's not vaccinate this part of the population. They would get immunity on their own, because there is a danger there, a very important danger that we should be aware of. So I think the idea of vaccinating everybody by stages, I think, is probably the safest and the best one.
And then just linking it in terms of the potential long-term side effects, something that's been asked a few times, I'll make this the final question, is with the mRNA vaccines, because your own cells grow features that invoke your own immune response, especially in young people who've got all their lives to live, has the thought of any autoimmune disease, any cancers arising later on in their lives been thought of, and how do we assess those, and is it worth that risk?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sorry, this question was asked and I sort of skipped the answer. So I think it's a legitimate fear, because we are basically injecting foreign genetic material in our body. Now, for these RNA vaccines, you have to be aware that this is RNA. So RNA cannot get integrated into DNA. You need a reverse transcriptase to turn RNA into DNA. And we don't have a reverse transcriptase in our body. So there's no way that this RNA can join or can be inserted in our genome and give you long-term effects. That it's chemically not possible. It's not that it has never been seen, it's that it chemically cannot happen. You cannot have a deoxyribonucleic acid and a ribonucleic acid joined together. They're chemically different. They don't link. So there's no way, without that enzyme, which we don't have, there's no way that this RNA can get integrated into our genome and give you problems later on. What's going to happen with an RNA vaccine is that a certain amount of this RNA is going to get into your body. This RNA is going to go into a certain amount of cells, and these cells are going to produce a protein. But that's it, and that's going to be, it's not all the cells in your body that are going to produce the protein. It's going to be a certain number of cells. These cells eventually are going to die off. I mean, and that's it. And this RNA is going to degrade. So your cells are not going to be producing this protein for the rest of your life. This RNA is not going to become a permanent part of your genetic material. So the long-term effects of these vaccines, if you vaccinate a 20-year-old, this vaccine is going to disappear from the system in probably months or years or less. So if you are in your 40s, you're not a single cell in your body would have a trace of that vaccine left. So I don't think this should be a worry long term. I think vaccines, if the problems that vaccines give are usually immediate, this sort of, for instance, this sort of semi-anaphylactic reactions that we saw are probably the kind of things that we should worry the most, because what you see is an immune response, and the immune response, if it's excessive, that can give you problems. That's what we should perhaps be looking more into. Long-term side effects, the concept of vaccines don't normally give you long-term side effects. And yes, this is a different kind of vaccine. It's an RNA vaccine, but I think this the difference between the RNA and DNA should, in that case, reassure us that we are safe, that this RNA is not going to mess up our genes in any way and give you long-term effects in years down the line.
And I think it's important to say that although it's the first ever mRNA vaccine, there's been years of research in mRNA. It was going to come anyway in future vaccines.
Totally, I agree. And although it looks something that we just got out of the hat in the past year, it's something that's been researched for decades. So and it's been tested in animals and done all the experiments. I think is as safe as you can wish for this technique. And obviously there may be some hiccups. And for instance, we saw some unexpected allergic reactions. But what we're going to see, I don't think it's in the sort of areas that people are seeing, like, oh, this we're going to get our genes scrambled, or this is something that's going to last forever. I don't think that is happening with this sort of technology.
Thank you, Elena, for organizing this, and thank you, Dr. Macip, for taking the time. This has been really, really good, and we really appreciate it. So for anyone who's asked questions, we've made notes of them, and Dr. Macip, if it's all right with you, we'll send them through to you, and yeah, we'll distribute any answers you have to those who've asked them. So guys, thanks for the questions. All really important. I think just to wrap up, because we're at 8 o'clock now, I think we'll open the question to the floor if anyone has any opinions on whether, like the question that Bikram asked at the start, on whether the vaccine should be compulsory for healthcare workers. Anyone involved with patients, should it be compulsory? Does anyone have any opinions on that?
Can I break the ice and give you my opinion first, and then you can go? I think it's a very excellent question. This is a very good question. And although, as you have seen in the past hour, I'm very pro vaccines, and I think vaccines are one of the best things we can have. I don't think that they should ever be compulsory. And I think this is stepping into a very complicated ethical area. And we should we could see the sort of the opposite effect. If you force people to vaccinate, people are going to react, just trying to run away from the vaccine. And we see it before, I mean, in many things. So whenever you pass a law to try to forbid something, people just want to do the opposite. And in more countries, in some countries more than others, and me coming from Southern Europe, I'm more used to this sort of attitude that people would like to do the opposite of what you tell them. So I think the way, and let's hear what you guys think, I mean, because you are going to be the ones being in the front lines soon. So the way that this should be addressed is trying to educate and explain why this is important. This is we're discussing this about COVID now, but this is an issue that every year happens with flu vaccines. Medical personnel don't want to get vaccinated for flu. And this is crazy, because they are there seeing patients with flu, and not only getting flu, but transmitting flu to everybody. There's a lot of doctors and nurses that will not get the flu vaccine every year. So this is a problem that you are going to see later on in your lives. And we cannot force these people to get the flu vaccine the same way we cannot force them to get the COVID vaccine, I think. But let's see what you guys think about this.
Just coming back onto that, Dr. Macip, but we can ask, as medical students here, or nursing students, or midwifery students, we can ask individuals in those professions to get their hepatitis B vaccines, and have to have them so they're not allowed to go to surgery. That's a requirement. We can ask them to obviously be vaccinated against TB. So flu, regardless, has been going influenza, but if we can do that and make them mandatory, you won't get a job in any trust until you can prove that you've been vaccinated and what dates. So why can't we do exactly the same with COVID?
Yeah, I think it's a valid point. It's definitely a valid point, and I think this is an argument that's been around even longer when we talk about child vaccination. So a lot of, in some countries, or some people would say, your child is not vaccinated, they cannot go to school. But what you're doing now is you are preventing somebody to access one of their rights, which is a good education. And, or in this case, in the hospital, you're preventing somebody to access free health just by not getting the vaccine. We're stepping into a very dangerous zone because you are deciding who can get into the hospital or not. I mean, it's true that in some cases it can be done for safety purposes, but in a situation in which, like COVID, they can argue back saying, okay, yeah, but I don't want to get the vaccine because I'm not going to die of this. I'm young. The chances of me getting infected are little. If I get infected, I'm not probably going to have a strong reaction. So this is not the same as hepatitis C, which is very difficult to get rid of. So people can argue back with this sort of the ethical issue of personal freedom, which in countries like ours needs to be respected as much as you can. It can come back to some of the other things we've seen in COVID, for instance. Why cannot we make mandatory GPS tracing of people in Europe? They did it in China and or in Southern Asia, and they managed to trace all the contacts of the infected people very easily because you know all the time where people are because everybody has a phone, so you can GPS track it, no problem. This in Europe is seen as the ultimate evil, having the state knowing where you are. And you can say, but I mean, yeah, but it's not. They're not using it against you. They're using it to protect you. But this is. It steps into a zone where the state controls the people, which is basically against everything we stand in democratic countries. So although the end is desirable, the means may not be. And I think although sometimes I even think that should be the case, that we should force people to understand that this is a good solution. The reality is that trying to implement these sort of rules can lead very easily to a revolution or to people just fighting against these sort of rules, which then you get the opposite effect. That's how I see it.
Yeah, and just following up on that, I think I completely agree with you. Meg made an interesting comment on the Mental Capacity Act. So people do have the right to make the wrong decisions, but also I think coercion may not pay back because it will only make people more suspicious on why we want them to get it. And I think, and that's the purpose of this whole event as well, education will be the only tool we can in the long term sustainably use to get people to understand the benefit of the vaccines. But I think the big problem with our generation, we don't realize how good vaccines are because they are so good. We have benefited so much from how well they've worked that we are not aware of how much they benefit us and what they're saving us from, because we haven't realistically lived anything like that before. And this pandemic is obviously new for us, but thinking that less than a century ago, this didn't happen, people would die from simple pneumonias and things like that. And I think, again, too many people are not aware enough, and that's why we need more of these events and really kind of try to get this science to the public and to people and get them listening. And I think it's good timing. So now everybody, we had about 100 people here. I hope all these 100 people will go back for Christmas at home. They'll have a good argument they can bring to the family table, hopefully the reduced family table or Zoom Christmas meetings. But I think that's the only sustainable way forward. But I really hope that we won't have to end up suffering from it, from how not using the vaccines impacts us. And I think that's what we've seen with measles in America, loads of children dying from it when they shouldn't have, because we have the capacity. And that's also the shame that in our countries where we have access to those, paradoxically people don't want, whereas in the countries where people don't have access to those and would like, they just can't access them. And that's the world we unfortunately live in. Yeah.
If anyone else has any other questions, then after we've finished, then just message them to Vikram, me, or Elena, and we'll try and get those out to tomorrow, I think, if possible. I think here would be a good place to wrap up if everyone's happy.
I think we've let Dr. Macip go on. I wouldn't know how to talk so fluently and so articulately for so long without needing any water or anything like that. You've been amazing, Dr. Macip. So please, you've managed to grab all our attention for so long. Please come over to the medical school sometime and lecture us, because I'm sure you do a very, very good job. Don't tell anyone else that, but yeah, I think you would.
Thank you very much, guys. I mean, for me, it's very exciting to talk to the new generation. I think it's very important that these things are discussed. And you are the future of medicine. And I come from a long line of doctors. My grandfather was a GP. My dad was a GP. I'm a medic, but a lab medic, let's say. And I see how medicine has lost this human side. And I think it's very important that the new generation, you guys, realize, I mean, we've been discussing about ethics and about social issues, which I think are very important in medicine. And sometimes medicine is only focused in the medical part, in the biological part. And there's the human part that it gets forgotten sometimes. So for me, it's a real pleasure to spend an evening with you guys, listening to very good questions. You asked, I think, all the key questions, so you guys are on target. And I do hope that I can see you in the medical school once this thing is over and we can have face-to-face lectures. And yeah, it's been a real pleasure to waste my voice with you this evening and talking about these topics. Thank you very much again for inviting me.
It was really our pleasure. Thank you very much.